Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Mike Chu. We're going to be talking about a very brand new book that just came out recently, The Unseen Realm, Michael Heiser. And it's like, whoa, Michael Heiser? How's that happening? And like, I thought the book was already out. My post to other people the other day, it's like, you can't interview Michael Heiser. Yeah, so that was a little awkward for some people, I'm sure. But this is what they call the expanded edition. So this is they took extra stuff that Mike had written before passing away and put it into a book. Apparently, it's 40% booger. Gosh, and we're going to talk about that today. So Mike has been, close associates, maybe even friends. I don't know the full story there. With Michael Heiser when he was on Earth with us, and very familiar with his work, and even still doing stuff with what Mike has left as far as organizations and stuff like that. So, wanted to get him on, and we could talk about the book, what's in it, what's different, and then maybe encourage people to check it out. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me, Zach.
Yeah, this would be fun. So, just for people that aren't familiar with you or your background, what do you do in association with Michael Heiser, like currently? And did you help at all with this book?
Okay, so I'll take it one piece at a time. So the several hats that I do wear,
Mm,
I am a co-host of two podcasts generally. The first one is the Divine Council Worldview podcast, and that one is a project of the Michael S. Heiser Foundation. So Dr. Heiser's original nonprofit, which was called McClot, his wife Drina, his widow, I should say, actually became the president of that nonprofit, and it
okay.
was renamed to sort of make it a little bit more closely associated with Dr. Heiser, so that also people understand like this is actually connected to him. And so we've been doing this podcast now for over a year. Ron Johnson, one of Mike's closest friends when he was alive, is the co-host as well with me on that podcast. And currently we've been going through books of the Bible, and right now we're in the midst of doing a Gospel of John study. So he and I are just trying to continue that kind of legacy where Dr. Heiser would go through a book of the Bible and try to bring out and piece out the portions in the scripture that touch upon the supernatural, that touch upon a divine counsel worldview. The other hat that I wear is I'm also a co-host on the Awakening School of Theology's Ask a Scholar podcast. And that is a project of the Awakening School of Theology. And that was the school that Dr. Heiser helped start up when he moved down to Jacksonville, Florida, and start up this theology school that was geared towards providing seminary content for the layperson. And so, on top of doing that podcast, I'm the academic director at the school. Uh, Dr. Heiser had asked me to take over his position prior to his passing. I was graduating from Gordon Conwell that year, and there was already, we already had a clue that the progression of the disease was not going to stop. And so I think as they were planning on what was going to happen when that day eventually came, he had approached me to actually possibly take this over. I hadn't technically yet graduated when he proposed that
Huh.
question.
Yeah.
So I had to take a little while to just think through it, talk with my wife, and eventually, yeah, this was something I wanted to do. It's like I'm literally going to be done with my master's of divinity and I'm jumping into a doctorate program. Yes, I'll take over. I'll help lead the academics within the online school. So yeah, I've been doing that ever since he passed away. And so it's been a really fun journey of just being involved in those two major kind of projects related to Heiser's legacy.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you do anything with the book at all? It's okay if not, of course.
So some folks at Lexham had reached out to me to ask about where are possible materials, ideas that they could possibly draw for adding additional material into the book. I think they were still trying to figure out how to incorporate the material into the book.
Hmm.
at the same time not changing the actual text. I think that was part of where they were struggling. And they were also wanting to make sure that they could find all the possible additional material that was written by Mike. They didn't want to bring in someone outside to add an additional material yet into this book, right? They wanted it to be clearly that this was from Dr. Heiser. And so one of the recommendations I did mention to them was the original publication had a companion website, the More Unseen Realm. And so I made a recommendation to maybe check that material out and maybe bring in some of that material, because that technically all was written by Dr. Heiser, and maybe put it as like some sense like a sidebar or something on the side to make it clear, hey, this is additional material. So what I did not know was that apparently Dr. Heiser had actually written material that he was writing. And my guess, and I noticed when I opened the book for the first time, that there was a new preface and it was dated 2019. And this is my speculative guess. He had talked about doing and gathering material for an Unseen Realm 2 book for a long time. He's mentioned it on the podcast that he used to run. He mentioned it in conversations with people, and at conferences that he was at. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the material that we find in this book originally was supposed to be designated for an Unseen Realm 2. But with time being limited as it was, it just makes sense. He didn't have enough time to actually fully write out a full book, but it totally could be added into the original one as expanded content. So I think what the Lexham team did was pretty wise and pretty shrewd. It's a really good way of bringing that in and not changing any of the original text without Mike's permission. So I think that was a wise move.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you put it that way. So on one hand, yeah, no, it makes total sense, because it's like, I don't know, it's almost like speaking for someone else would be a little weird. But at the same time, I'm interested to see in the future if we get another one of those books where you get a bunch of scholars together, and not like specifically Heiser's views, but like kind of like one of those in honor of Michael Heiser book, where you just put a bunch of scholarly papers related to what Heiser wrote about, that they've done for like people like John Walton and others. Carmen Ives was in one of those. So yeah, this is like a really, really cool book, actually. Like it's got Leviathan on there, and I usually don't really care about physical books, because they just take the shelf on space on the shelf. But this is like a really cool book, and considering the topic and all that stuff, I feel like I definitely had to have it. Yeah, what'd you think of it? Pretty cool, huh?
I mean, it was gorgeous when they featured it on the live stream. Like I immediately took notice of the fact that they all went out with the fact that on the actual hardcover itself they went foil. Like, holy cow, that's not a cheap process. And the binding is really good too.
Yeah.
So it's a good quality book. Like, if you enjoy how like there are some books that are just done really, really well.
Yeah.
This is definitely one of those kind of moments of like, this is really good.
Yeah.
One thing I do know, however, I think Lexham was a little surprised by the excitement and demand, because from what I understand, they had over 20,000 copies that they had printed to get ready for the release. And after the live stream, apparently they sold out like all 20,000. And I don't remember ever any biblical study based book selling out before even the release date.
Yeah.
So I mean it's just ridiculous to hear that. It's amazing. But I guess I also shouldn't be too surprised. I've been going to the Evangelical Theological Society's conferences for the last 2 years, and also SBLs. And the Lexham Press booth in the bookstore area, by the end of each of those conferences, all the books of the Unseen Realm and even other Heiser related books are all gone.
Huh.
So like
Interesting.
they ultimately sell them all out by the end of both ETS and SBL for the last 2 years. It
Huh.
was just crazy. Because I would see it. It's like, oh cool, they're still selling Mike's book. And then by like I go back to the bookstore on the last day to see if there's any last minute deals or something I want to finally pick up. And the Lexington booth, like Mike's stuff is pretty much gone.
Yeah, that's wild.
So
That's really
it's
interesting.
encouraging. That means
Yeah.
that people are like, and these are actual folks who are doing either a master's, doctorate, a
Mhm.
THM, and they're checking out his material. And these are evangelical and even not necessarily evangelical scholars who are picking up these books.
Yeah. Here's a fun one. Purple Pill Philosophy asked if there's any plans for a naked Bible cruise, like on a cruise ship in an unseen realm video game. Now, the video game would be pretty wild. I mean, they're coming out with like some Bible related games soon, like really, really soon. It should be pretty cool, kind of like Assassin's Creed almost. But yeah, I guess there's no plan so far, right?
There, not that I know of. I would hold off from from commenting on that.
That would
But
be
from
pretty
what I know
cool.
of, there isn't any
Yeah.
plans for a cruise or a video game. Though the video game idea, that's new. That's actually a kind of fun idea.
Yeah, well, he says that Heiser talked about it, so I'm sure he did somewhere. Um,
Oh man,
also,
yeah,
there's also, oh gosh, wait, Mike, can you put yours on the screen
yeah,
one more time? It's my green screen's been a little weird. It's like, look at that. That is just cool. I want a book like that. Gosh, and I have it, so
yeah.
that works out.
If folks are wondering what that is, that's actually the Hebrew from Psalm 82, verse 1.
Yeah.
Right. So like the first word here, Elohim. So essentially, Elohim or God stands, takes his place, and then this is the gathering and El. So the gathering of El, or divine council, is how we would generally say. And so it's basically the Hebrew of
Mhm.
Psalm 82, verse 1. If people are curious
Cool.
what this is,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, it's pretty neat.
It's like, duh. Yeah, I knew that. Yeah, right.
I just figured, like, it's a really cool kind of reminder that
uh,
yes, this is written in Hebrew. It was
Fair enough.
written in Hebrew.
Yeah. And Hebrew coincidentally looks really cool. Some languages are just like, yeah, that's not the coolest looking. It looks kind of like scribble scrabble, but yeah, that works out. So can you just give us a summary of not only this book but the Unseen Realm in general for people that haven't read it yet?
So the 20-second summary of the Unseen Realm, I would put it, is simply, this is Dr. Heiser's proposal on how to incorporate the supernatural worldview of the ancient biblical writers and audience
Mhm.
into our understanding of the scriptures. To just begin, you won't get a full picture of it, but begin exploring and realizing that the scriptures are steeped in a world and culture that is not 21st century America, right? And that they are coming from different needs, different concerns, and also a different understanding of how the world works, including how the supernatural interfaces with the real world as well.
Mhm.
I hope that's a good summary. It
Yeah.
just dives into these moments where we as moderns may be confused by, because we generally think the physical world and the supernatural world are so bifurcated that there's like a hard separation line. And yet the reality is that the biblical writers and their audiences, they viewed the supernatural and the physical world as more enmeshed than we're comfortable with.
Mm.
And so a lot of what this book goes into are those biblical passages and cultural references and the history of the scripture, where we would never have even understood this, because it is coming from a very foreign culture. It is coming from a very different time.
Mm.
And at my church, one of the things that we have been saying is that when you open up the scriptures, one of the things you may not realize you're doing is you are actually traveling into a different world. You're traveling actually to a different place and time. And if you are cognizant of that, then you'll be more curious, to ask questions first, to be inquisitive instead of making assumptions. right? Anytime you go to a new foreign place, it's probably a wise move to take a day or so to acclimate to what's the scene, what's the vibe, what's going on, instead of just assuming, oh, everything here works exactly how it does for me, like Boston. No, it won't. It absolutely won't. They don't take the same currency. They don't speak the same language. They don't even mark time the same way I do. You have to take some time to acclimate to the environment. And so whenever we go through the scriptures, that's actually what we're doing without even realizing it. So that's how I would say it's a great intro primer into the reality that the people who wrote the scriptures came from a worldview that assumed that the physical and spiritual worlds were more enmeshed than we ever thought it could be.
Yeah.
And that the physical and the spiritual world can affect one another in tangible ways. At least that's their proposal. That's their assumption that it could happen. You don't have to immediately believe it, but at least start realizing they thought that this was possible.
Yeah. So of course that gets into the divine council, sons of God, Satan, many of the different supernatural beings that are mentioned in the Bible and their context and how at least Michael Heiser thought we should understand those texts. But a very, very scholarly take at them. So, what other scholars have said and others, so whether you accept them or not, they're all serious views. I don't think he ever held anything that at least wasn't well educated. It might be wrong, but at least it was well educated. What were you going to say?
Well, I think one way to think about it is that the way that Mike wanted to present this material was, in some sense, scholarship has known about this material for well over a century, ever since they started discovering other manuscripts, other texts, evidence of the ways that the ancients thought about the world around them outside of the Hebrew Bible. And I think we within the evangelical sphere are slowly becoming more comfortable with that reality that, oh yes, the Israelites were enmeshed in a very large cultural river. I'm using a phrasing from John Walton, the ancient cultural river that they were all swimming in. And sometimes the Israelites swam with the current of that culture. And yet there are other moments when they swam perpendicular to it or even against it, right? That they opposed some of the assumptions and ideas that their neighbors thought that the world ran by this way, or that, of course, Baal is the ultimate God. No, they would actually push back against the prevailing culture and thoughts.
Right.
And so that's the world that we enter into oftentimes. And then when we get into the New Testament, we see that more so, because then we're dealing not just with ancient Near Eastern culture, we're now then dealing with additionally Roman and Hellenistic culture that also had their own different set of gods and religious beliefs and assumptions of the world.
Right. Yeah. So I just want to put this on the screen. Gosh. And as you were saying earlier, the book makes it pretty clear what the added content is. I imagine there might be a little bit extra that's added, but at least we can know with very good confidence. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's like little boxes here in the text, so that this is all extra stuff that wasn't in the original. And as others have said, is 40% extra. That's a lot of extra text. So it's not like it's just like a few extra pages just to try to get you to buy the book or whatever. Like it's a lot of extra stuff in it.
I think one of when folks are planning for a book, from how I understand it, there's always sort of like a word count limit. And so one of the things that Mike had wanted, but he couldn't really put in originally, was his full bibliography. And so that's actually a good portion of that additional 40%, is that in the back is pretty much the full on bibliography that it took for him to write out and do the research for the whole book. Right. And so, what was it? Dr. Heiser used to say this all the time, which was that the dirty little secret about Dr. Heiser is that he never had an original thought. Right. That it was simply that he didn't make it up. He's not pulling something straight from from the air. It really is based on actual decades, if not over a century worth of research, language studies from all this large variety of biblical scholarship, biblical study scholarship. Just not necessarily a lot of evangelicals actually know about it or ever read about it or even wanted to read about it. And one of the great things about Mike was he was a good consolidator. He knew how to take that material and then consolidate it down, distill it down into a way that a regular layperson could understand. And so I think that was one of his giftings, if anything. He could consolidate, he could gather the data, and he could communicate that in a way that made sense to a lot of folks.
Yeah, there's 60 pages of bibliography. That is crazy. That is a lot of pages. 60 pages.
Yeah.
So why that's valuable, you might be thinking, oh, that's weird. I don't care about that. Because one of the problems for people that are not scholars is that it's difficult to know where to look to find what pages, what papers, what books are worth reading. So, there's 60 pages in here of content worth reading on. So that in itself could be really helpful for people that are really trying to understand the topic. I mean, what Heiser puts in his books is kind of just a summary of the main arguments. Yes. But when he'll cite one paper in 3 pages, but the page, like, for example, Amar Anas, his like revolutionary paper is like a 20-30 page paper. And then Heiser is summarizing it in like 3 pages. You're missing out a lot of stuff. But yeah, so it's really helpful to dig into scholarship and the other resources, other views, and so you're not missing things.
Yeah, I think it's also just that sometimes people may have this caricature of academia. Part of the problem, part of what has to happen within academia is that and I mean, I'm still in it. When you're making a certain conjecture or you're proposing an idea, you have to really go through the snuff to actually like prove your point, that you have to have solid research to show that this isn't something that you're just making up out of thin air. And so that really does take a lot of time. I was talking with another friend earlier today that, for example, Dr. Heiser's expertise was in Semitic languages. So that includes Hebrew, Ugaritic, Akkadian, Aramaic, and a bunch of others, all within the Semitic family. And what's crazy about that is that if you're in that kind of field and you want to study a particular manuscript from, say, Akkadian, there are not many people who know how to translate Akkadian.
Sure.
You can learn it. There are now actually, cool Zondervan resources for that. But in the end, if you are going to study a manuscript and try to get its material, and there's not an English translation already done for you, guess who's doing the translation? You are. And so then you have to translate it, work through that, and then you have to get that vetted by other folks who also know Akkadian so that they make sure your translation is up to snuff. And only then, ultimately, will that maybe be part of a research paper, and then it will be available as a resource for someone in the future so that they could then use like, oh, great, thank you for translating this. Now I can understand this little manuscript, this story, so then I can compare it to my own research. This is why scholarship takes so long, because there's not many people with the skills to do that.
Yeah.
It is overwhelming at times. It can feel very like this is so much. And I mean, in many ways, this is one of the sadnesses I feel about when Mike passed, was because he was one of those few folks, and an evangelical as well, who had that skill set. And there's just not many folks like him who can do that.
Yeah.
And with the actual, confessional convictions as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's very, very rare, and to even be public about it to begin with. So that, they exist, but it's like they're going to write 3 books and nobody's ever going to read the books because nobody knows they exist. So yeah, Heiser was really talented about all that different stuff. So as far as like as I was saying before, the different little sections. So just so people could get a general idea about what was in the book. Let's see. Yeah. So he's kind of like it's kind of labeled like reading your Bible again for the first time. Rules of engagement: God's entourage, God alone, as in heaven, so on earth. Only God is perfect. Peril and providence. Trouble in paradise, like the Most High. And these have just the names alone don't tell you a ton of information, to be honest. But as far as new stuff, so chapter 1, Christocentric readings of the Bible and reading in context. We'll talk about that later. Creeds and Bible study, how do creeds interact? Chapter 3 has a talk about divine counsel and its hierarchy. Chapter 4 debates about divine counsel and other Elohim. Chapter 5, let us make man in the image of God. Genesis 1, 26, 27, what does it mean and refer to? Chapter 9, I was surprised by this, predestination and open theism in regard to 1 Samuel 23. Then there's Yahweh and El terminology, Canaanite conceptions. So a lot of really interesting stuff that was not in the original book. And any idea where all this came from? Was it just like websites, extra notes?
I think this was actually material he had written. This was what he was trying to incorporate into eventually like an Unseen Realm 2. And a lot of the stuff that you brought up are common points of confusion or objections that people had, right? And so obviously, Mike wanted to at least clear the fog around that. So like, for example, like when you were mentioning chapter 1, the Christocentric readings, that was a common kind of pushback against understanding the ancient Near Eastern context or even Second Temple period context, because, well, Jesus said the Old Testament is all about him, right? And that's a paraphrase. And Mike, in several different mediums, whether it was like a Logos show that they were kind of like test running or in interviews, he's made it very clear that he doesn't like some of the variations of Christocentric readings. And, what that is saying, if for folks who may not know what that is, it's a discipline of Bible interpretation. That's how I would boil it down to. The technical term is hermeneutic. Do you use a Christocentric hermeneutic? Meaning, especially with the Old Testament, when you're reading the Old Testament and you're getting ready for a sermon, if you're a pastor, how do you read this particular passage and how do you see Jesus in there? Like that's the caricature generally about how folks think of Christocentric.
Right.
There are many variations of Christocentric, to be honest. I mean, my doctoral program is in preaching from study to the pulpit. And so our first year, we had to, as a cohort, come down individually to where do we land on the debate about Christocentric reading versus other ways of reading it. And so the two real possibilities were theocentric, which is theo for God, so God-centric reading, or Christocentric reading. At that time, a couple of years ago, I was probably closer towards theocentric because I did not agree to the idea of I need to somehow find Jesus in literally every bit of the Old Testament, especially if we're talking about things from Leviticus, for example, or about the making of the tabernacle and about the candlesticks. Like the candlesticks are not talking about Jesus. It's connected to how the tabernacle is set up. It's connected to Eden, but it's not Jesus directly. Like it's like that's the frustration. It's like you're almost tempted to just like insert Jesus there. But to be fair, there are variations of the Christocentric interpretation, and that this is what I think Dr. Heiser was alluding to in chapter 1, is that there are Christocentric practices that does not do that, right? And one way of doing that is, so part of my training, it would be where study the passage, understand the passage's local context. So what is the text's main idea? So that includes, you have to understand what is the ancient culture's context? What's the history of it? What was said before? What was said right after? So you have that local context. Get your idea from that. Great. Step 2, what is the book talking about? Like the whole book. So if you're talking a passage from Exodus, then figure out what the passage is talking about, but now put that into the context of the entire book of Exodus. It's like, okay, now we zoomed out. And then after that, when you get the idea of, well, what is this with the book, then what's the whole canon? Old and New Testament. Where is it going? What is it maybe possibly pointing to or alluding to or foreshadowing? And so in that way, you could possibly do a valid Christocentric interpretation and even a sermon, right? So you could say, look at King David when he was dancing before the Lord as the Ark of the Covenant was coming into Jerusalem. You know, local context. This is right after the debacle of the poor guy who touched the Ark, and now David's doing everything correctly. He's doing everything right. Worship's happening correctly. And the greater context of Samuel is the setup about how God is going to anoint and make the house of David essentially a dynasty that lasts forever. What is the canonical ultimate when you pull yourself out in the larger story? David is a foreshadowing of the ultimate king who will come and bring full-on proper worship of the one creator God. And his name is going to be Jesus. Right? Like, that's a way you could do Christocentric preaching that honors the context of the text and still bring people ultimately to think about Jesus towards the end. But, it takes a lot of work to do that. You have to be willing to do that. And sometimes a lot of, the caricatures of Christocentric preaching, and in some sense validly, sometimes it just feels like I'm just going to tack Jesus on. and that's not, that's not I think that's what Mike was pushing against. But I would suspect that what I described is a proper more reading, because we're going from the original context to the greater context of the book, and then eventually to the entire story of the canon, right? And if you're leading people on that journey, they can connect those dots. They could follow you along and understand the scripture in a larger way. Personally, though, I really wish I had a conversation with Mike about this, especially as I've been doing this doctorate program.
Okay. Why so?
Part of it is because, like I said, there's this big debate, especially amongst, preachers, homiletic, like, do you do Christocentric or do you do theocentric? And it's almost like half and half. Like,
really?
Because there are people who understand, like, there are problems with Christocentric, because it does sometimes. If some folks propose this almost literal, like, I'm just going to tack Jesus onto the Old Testament text, and that's not honoring. Like, that just feels a little tacky, to be blunt. But theocentric feels safer because it lets me, at least we can all say that the Old and New Testament is all talking about God. Like, maybe it's talking about the Father, maybe it's talking about the Spirit, maybe it's talking about Jesus, maybe it's talking about this particular moment with God in the Old Testament. It's safer in some sense, and it lets me be able to take people on a journey. That's kind of why I was more towards theocentric interpretation. But in the last year and a half, last 2 years, especially as I've been thinking about it more, I've been more and more convinced of a new term to avoid even this fight. Is it theocentric or Christocentric? I would propose a term that Dr. Michael Bird had actually brought out, which is Christotelic. Christotelic being the end goal. And generally, like, the way that he had proposed was that when we read the Old Testament, we probably should look at it more. Yes, you've got a little Christocentric, but it's probably more Christotelic, that the Old Testament is looking towards Christ. That, for me personally, and probably what I hopefully will propose within my paper and within my project, is a Christotelic interpretation that not only affects the Old Testament, but also the New, right? Because within Christocentric preaching, the Old Testament is always looking towards the cross, always looking towards Jesus. And Christocentric preaching in New Testament, generally the move is we always are looking back at the cross. But my proposal is that Christotelic orients us towards, yes, it's no problem. Look towards the cross. Look towards the resurrection. Look towards the ascension. But Christocentric also gives us the ability to look towards the eschaton, to look towards the consummation, to look towards the final day where everything is said and done. Because there are still some things in the Old Testament that technically it doesn't seem to have been done yet. And there are definitely a lot of things still in the New Testament that's still not done. Like Jesus still hasn't come back physically. And we're still looking towards Christ. Jesus isn't done yet. And so that's my proposal, is that maybe a Christocentric hermeneutic might be a better way to describe how to balance out the difficult task of interpretation of Old and New Testament texts in a unified form, at least in a unified direction.
Yeah. You could have just said, hey, I came up with the Christocentric. Nobody would have known.
No, Dr. Michael Bird, he's awesome. I mean, so, gotta give props to the man. Like it's a great phrase. I just want to add my own addition, my own flair, which is why stay in the Old Testament only? It can be expanded beyond that. Really should be expanded beyond that.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So I'm struggling to figure out what direction I want to go with that. So Mike said in his book, he said, a coherent Christocentric hermeneutic recognizes that all portions of the Bible, rightly understood in their original ancient contexts, play a role in the formation of a mosaic, or maybe I should say a meta-narrative that ultimately directs us to Christ. Everything in the Bible isn't about Jesus, and it doesn't need to be to contribute to the progression and outcome of God's plan for humanity, the person and work of Jesus Christ. So how does that interact with your Christocentric view? Is that kind of the same thing with different words, or
it's similar? That's probably what I meant about. I really wish I had a chance to talk with Mike about this. I didn't know he was even thinking about this. Right? Because and the reason I wanted to start using Christocentric more is because it avoids this confusion with this general fight that happens amongst homiletics and within interpretation.
Yeah,
because everyone like I almost want to say it almost sometimes feels like it's the good Sunday school answer. Yes, we should do a Christocentric interpretation. Because who doesn't want to be able to have the science, the art of actually going into an Old Testament passage and discovering Jesus in there, right? Like we think of the Emmaus Road and man, what did he tell those two disciples? How did he show them? What did he show them? How to do this? And we don't have the record of that. We don't have what did he actually say to them. But and that's why there's a debate. What is Christocentric? What does that mean? I affirm what Jesus said is true, that the Old Testament, the prophets and the Torah, they testify about him. But in what manner? How does that happen? Right? And I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up on is, well, what's the how? How did he do that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Side note, someone commented those wings, and yes, people might be thinking that just the green screen's messing up and there's not actually a camel behind me. There is a camel behind me, and the green screen is not actually messing up. It's actually because I'm a celestial being of some kind, maybe one of the sons of God, or angels, or Nephilim. Hard to tell, really.
Hard to tell. Sure. I hope you're not in your molting season right now.
Molting season? Oh, shoot. I don't remember that in the Bible, so gosh. It must have been the book of Enoch who said that. So yeah, I wanted to draw things back a little bit, just a little bit. So of course, the verses that this whole idea of a Christocentric view comes from is, so you have Luke 24:27. It says, then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. And the phrase written about can be translated a few different ways. So that's not terribly clear. But yeah, it seems like it's saying, hey, the Old Testament refers to Jesus in some way. But in reality, when we think about it, the phrase, written about, himself is kind of actually vague. Like, what does that actually mean to be written about Jesus? Does that mean, like, when we're looking at these Genesis 5, this guy begot this guy and this guy begot this guy, that's writ that's talking about Jesus? Like that, I I have a hard time believing that's what Jesus is thinking there. But that's where the kind of challenge is. It's like, what does it mean to be written about? But in the reality, I want to point out that it is kind of vague. So we shouldn't assume that every single passage is somehow having Jesus in the story somehow, or like he was
Mhm.
actually there next to David or something like that. Um, unless
And
there's some reason in the text to think that. What were we gonna say?
yeah, well, and that's what I mean. That's part of the challenge and why it's such a debatable thing, right? And that's why what I mentioned about that theocentric versus Christocentric, that's why it happens because people do
Yeah.
wonder. Well, there's this ambiguity. What is even the word about? Like, what is it trying to imply? And I think it can be affected, at least in a modern Western context, here in the English speaking world.
Mm,
Are you going super literal? Or are you thinking more symbolically, more figuratively?
mhm.
That's where you get into the debates, right? Of
Yeah.
what does that mean?
Yeah, that's really
And
interesting. Not to interrupt, but oftentimes the people that take this super, super literal Christocentric approach are also the very super, super literal readers of the Bible. So, I'm reading the Bible literally, so Jesus must have been reading the Bible literally. But that's a really good point that Jesus could have been making that phrase in kind of like a metaphorical or figurative way. That's very interesting.
I think, one of the scholars that Dr. Heiser had interviewed years ago, it was even before he discovered his cancer.
Hmm.
His name is John Hilber, and he wrote a book on
Yeah.
Old Testament cosmology and relevance theory.
Yeah.
It's not the most intriguing name, but I
Not at
read
all.
through that book and it blew my mind
Yeah, it's a
because
good
of
book.
just how applicable his research was to the mindset of how do just regular human beings actually think. We don't think literally, right? More often than not, our minds have created shortcuts, certain phrases, metaphorical meanings, symbolic meanings that we culturally, because we've been culturally raised, we intuitively just pick up on it,
Hmm.
right? And we do it without even realizing it. And so that's what it's so strange about a literalist hermeneutic is that it actually defies what we as human beings naturally do. It's actually generally the last thing that our minds will go to as an interpretive model, and it will go there only when it has nothing else to compare.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right? So if what was it the Levitical phrasing, right? I'm trying to remember what was the phrasing. It was the your father's it's do not sleep with your mother because she
Oh,
is your father's. I can't remember. It was an idiom. It was a Jewish idiom. But that's part of what's going on there is that, well, that certain phrasing.
do not uncover your father's nakedness.
That's what it is. Yes, do not uncover the nakedness. It's like, what is that supposed to mean? And because our minds will naturally go down this kind of like modeling of like, okay, where have I heard any of this? Never. I don't remember or recollect anything. Well, what do the words literally mean? What's the most basic meaning of each of those words? And then let's
Hmm.
just piece that together. You come down to a literal interpretation or a literal understanding when you have no other options. That was what Hilner's research basically was pointing out,
Hmm.
that it's the last option generally because you have absolutely no cultural context to it, right?
Hmm.
And that is the danger, and that's actually part of what Mike had always pushed against was when there are these blind spots. If you have a lack of information and you're reading something new for the first time and you have no data about the context, then you will only go by what you can understand of the words themselves,
Hmm.
right? Imagine 200 years from now, people will be reading texts in history books about the Super Bowl. But if there is no such thing as a Super Bowl anymore, if there is no more NFL,
Mm.
and they have no understanding of what football is, what are they going to think when they read the term Super Bowl?
Right.
They have nothing to connect it to, no idea to connect it to. So then they'll just see Super Bowl, a really large bowl. Mike brought that up as an example.
It's a great bowl. It's really big, great.
A really giant bowl.
Perfect bowl.
Really large fruit.
Oh, that sounds great. And it came from giants because that's where the fruit, and it was really big fruit. What were you saying?
Yeah. And patriots love fruit, and so do eagles.
Wow.
And commanders. Yeah.
Well, not the Commanders, maybe the Redskins.
Yeah, and then if we have no idea what that is, like, wait, there are people. Anyway,
it's a pre-2019 text. I don't know when they changed the name.
Yes. But yeah, I mean, that was just one of the really coolest things that I encountered when I read through Hiller's work. It's like, wow. So that does explain a lot of things. And then once you start getting more of the data and ancient Near Eastern background, especially like of Genesis 1, it's kind of hard to read it as just a pure literal 7 days anymore. Yeah. Once you just start filling in those gaps in your mind of like, okay, so this was probably how the ancients thought, then maybe it's not a literal 24-hour, 7 days thing. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's just simply, it's not the default interpretation, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting how that whole phenomenon came about, the whole literalistic idea. And then also the Christocentric view also comes from John 5:39. It says, "These are the very scriptures that testify about me." So
yes,
Jesus is pointing to some scriptures. They testify about me. But what does that mean is the question, right? What does that mean? So I personally think that people kind of just, it says they testify. So I guess Jesus must be in every single story, right? Because I guess it's almost like that's all I can think of, or maybe someone else told them that, so that's how they feel like they have to interpret it. They can't think of anything else. I mean,
I think one way of maybe possibly thinking of it is actually going to another moment in the gospel stories, right, where you have Jesus doing the Sermon on the Mount, and he gives that famous line that some people use as a way to say, we don't ever have to care about the Old Testament law or the Old Testament in general. Matthew 5:17, where he says, in summary, I did not come. Do not think that I came to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. And the irony is, so many people interpret, even though he just said, I did not come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. And they assume the word fulfill means, oh, you came to end it. But no, I just said earlier, I did not come to abolish it, which would be ending it. So I did not come to end it. I did not come to abolish it. I came to fulfill it. So what is that supposed to mean? What is the fulfill supposed to mean?
Right.
When I was looking it up, the actual word, there's an interesting kind of sidebar in some sense that BDAG, the lexicon in the Greek, has about the word fulfill from Matthew 5:17. It has this little mention where, and it even uses Matthew 5:17 as an example. Fulfillment as in a prayer. And I got one time when I was preaching about this with my congregation, one of the things I pointed out was, it's as though Jesus is saying that the law and the prophets, as though there was a prayer that those two were having, and that Jesus was the answer, was the fulfillment to that prayer. He's the only one that could answer the prayer of the law and the prophets if we were to think of them as persons. Like as though they were a person wanting, desiring, longing, praying for something. How is this going to get answered? He came to fulfill it. He came to be the answer. So it's not about abolishing. It's about answering a heartfelt prayer. what is the Torah ultimately trying to pray for in a metaphorical way? What is it longing for? And what did the prophets long for? So anyways, that's just a way that I would kind of propose that may help with the hermeneutic. That I find it a very interesting way to conceptualize that the Old Testament is a story. It is a family history story that is telling of the people who are longing for something greater than what we probably have gotten used to. Yeah. And anyways, it's just part of the process we've been going through with our congregation. The way that we teach the scriptures is that it's not old versus new, that the old and the new is one whole story. And guess what? It's a family history book. It's our family history book. It's for our benefit. It is for our wisdom. It is for our formation. It is telling us, what did the people in the past go through? What can we learn from them? What wisdom can we gain from them? What were their mistakes? Don't we make the same kind of mistakes? Can we learn from that? Can we honor God better? Not do the things that they messed up in, right? It's a family history book. And family history books, I realized over the last couple of years, was a big thing, especially during the pandemic, because people felt so disconnected to anyone, literally, because of, figuratively, literally, in that they did not have a lot of human contact. And so then this drive to dig into your family tree, or to dig into and creating even a book that told your entire family history, it's been a thing that's still going on with some folks who actually want to do that. I realized that's pretty much what the Old and New Testaments are. They are a collection of the family history stories. And this is why it's important to actually read the scriptures. It's part of our formation.
Appreciate that. And I actually had John Hilber on my channel to talk about his book. So yeah, I'm like one of 3 interviews he's done or something like that. You know, some of these scholars, like, really great books, only been on like channels with like 100 views or something. So
man, yeah, it was such a good book. It was so good. It was so helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So in the second chapter, Heiser points out that some people use the historic Christian creeds as a way to guide our interpretation of the Bible, while they won't explicitly say we should use the creeds, hold the creeds in one hand, the Bible in the other, and make sure that they don't contradict or something like that. But people still don't seem to allow for that type of contradiction. Oftentimes it's like, hey, you know, this is my interpretation. Heiser will make his argument for his interpretation, and then someone might say, hey, that contradicts with the creeds. That's a problem. I can't accept that. What did Heiser say about this in his chapter? What was his approach to the historic creeds?
Well, this was, when I read this part, it was also a little bit of a chuckle I had, because he didn't use the terminology, but even the church that I'm currently, at and serving at, it's, in some sense, it fulfills what he's talking about. Because I think most people don't realize that there is actually a different camp of folks who are not anti-creedal and who are also not pro-creedal. They are non-creedal. And the church that I'm a part of is part of the Evangelical Covenant denomination. They are from sort of like that Reform, tradition, like they come from that kind of line, but they also mixed in with pietism, and they wanted that personal relationship with God, deep down Bible study kind of thing. They came down to this idea, the stance of, in the end, the creeds are good. They're good summaries of what does it mean to be a Christian. As of what does a Christian believe? Like, why you are who you are. What do you believe? But those are themselves the result of exegetical work that the church fathers had worked through themselves. They're summary statements of their work. And so the way to actually look at a non-creedal perspective, this is kind of basically what I think Dr. Heiser is proposing, is a non-creedal view, right? You can look at the creeds. You can even affirm, yes, that's good. I believe that. I think that is what the scriptures are talking about. But you don't use the creeds as the measuring rod for interpretation. The creeds themselves can stand up to interpretation from the scriptures because they're based on the scriptures. The measure that they are to be measured by the scriptures themselves. And they can stand up to snuff for that. I honestly believe that. But they should not be used as the actual measuring rod for interpretation and for doctrine. At least that's where my particular, the church that I'm at right now, that's their particular stance, a non-creedal stance. If you want to recite Apostles' Creed, if you want to recite the Nicene Creed, go for it. It's good. It's part of our history. It's part of our heritage. But don't use it as the interpretation tool. Don't use it as the measuring rod. And that just seems like what Dr. Heiser is saying here. He points out, I actually highlighted one part is, I just don't believe that creeds serve any role in exegesis of the biblical texts. And he continues on that the idea that creeds should guide the way we interpret scripture, I disagree. That's pretty much a non-creedal stance. He may not realize that's the official way of calling it, but that is a non-creedal way of looking at it. You can honor the creed in respecting that it's there and that it's a good summary of exegetical work. But the creeds are not meant to be the measuring rod for scripture. Oftentimes, the main point of what the creeds were for was that for everyone to be able to say, hey, how do I know I'm a Christian? Well, do you believe this? Do you believe Jesus was persecuted, that he was born of the Virgin Mary, that he was, handed over to Pontius Pilate? Do you believe these elements? Do you believe in the Nicene Creed? And do you believe that Jesus is the light of light, the God of gods, that he is, of God, of very God? Like, those are summaries of Old and New Testament scriptures. But they shouldn't be used as interpretative tools for scripture. They're the result of doing interpretation of scripture.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense for folks who are listening.
I think so. The thing that I think you really pointed out is oftentimes it's like, okay, we accept these beliefs, and I think Christian leaders sadly almost do some type of psychological manipulation of some kind, where it's like, if you're not part of these creeds, if you don't believe these specific creeds, then it's like you're a terrible. They don't know what he specifically says it, but it's like, those people who don't accept the creeds, they're bad people. They're progressives or whatever it is. They're not with us. They're not Christian. So it's like, well, we have to use these creeds to read the Bible to make sure that we're not part of that external group, and there kind of becomes like anxiety and stuff that makes things more difficult and complicated. Did you have something that you were going to say to that?
Well, I would recommend for folks who are just curious about like the history of creeds, because let's be honest, right? Many of us, you and I, we're coming from essentially Protestant denominations, right? Protestant evangelical denominations, but coming from the Protestant bloodline. And within Protestantism, we've had this kind of streak of skepticism towards creeds, right? Towards anything that feels very religiosity right there. And so we tend to not understand, like, why did people make this? What was the big deal? And that is just really kind of showing, in some sense, we have a lack of understanding of the church history and why they had to go through this, right? The one creed that is accepted across the board in the West and the East is the Nicene Creed. Is the one creed that is truly, my proposal is that it is ecumenical. That across the board, whether you are Protestant, whether you are Roman Catholic, whether you are Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Church of the East, you hold to the Nicene Creed. Because the whole point of why the Nicene Creed came up was because they were debating, who is Jesus? What was Jesus? Was he completely human? Was he completely God? Was he sort of like God. And that was what they were trying to clarify ultimately with the Nicene Creed. And the irony is that it passed, but it almost went forgotten. But ultimately, in the end, like, part of the value of the Nicene Creed is that it really helps summarize and focus, well, what is and who is Jesus in the end? What was he? Is he the God man, or is he a man that was elevated by God, or is he God with sort of, like, he was goddish? What was he? And that's ultimately what the creeds were trying to clarify for people, because we also have to remember most people did not have access to the scriptures. Also, most people could not read. And so they often were hearing snippets of scripture in church. And so what the creeds did was help at least summarize and bring in a concise summation of these very key points about what was Christian belief. What was it that the apostles held on to? So I would highly recommend resources from one of my professors, Dr. Donald Farburn. He is an evangelical scholar who focuses on Eastern Christianity. And he's written several books. The more recent one was on the global church. So basically, the church from the 1st century up to the 8th century, his contention was that that was the time frame when the church was still actually a unified whole, not the typical 1000 mark where the schism happened, but that it was up to around the 800s, because by that point, language, liturgy, things started changing so much that in many ways you start having very different camps by that point. And it just took 200 more years for everyone to realize, yeah, we have really diverged away from one another. But that for the first 800 something odd years, there was a unity within the larger body of Christ, as in like a almost uniform organization. It just eventually, West and East went their own different ways and pathways of understanding scripture, went their own different ways of practice, and also experience. The West went through essentially becoming the main state religion, versus with the East, they had to contend with the rise of Islam. And those differences shaped ultimately their doctrinal positions and also their practice in general.
So another thing that Heiser mentioned was that people sometimes think that if it's not in the creeds, that it's not important. So you have Heiser, who's like, we're missing a lot of stuff that's in the Bible that people are kind of ignoring, not talking about, or just misunderstanding. And then people say, hey, well, it's not in the creed, so really is it that important? But what would Heiser say to that?
Oh, I'm not sure what Heiser would say to that. What I would definitely probably guess,
We could
or
probably
I would
read
just
it.
say what I would say. The way I would answer that question is simply, the creeds themselves are based in a time and context as well, right? They had a very particular need and reason for why they had to come together and create those creeds. Very different reasoning. And even just like what I said earlier, not everyone could read. Not everyone had access to the scriptures. Oftentimes, the only times people interacted with the scriptures was when they were at services, in the gatherings, listening to someone who could read and read the scripture out loud for them to hear. But they wouldn't be able to go back home with like a whole Bible in their hands. They had to just simply remember what they had heard. And so I think when you realize that that's a little bit of what's going on in the environment, well, it kind of makes sense then when you look at the creed, like the Nicene Creed, why it has almost this rhythmic, almost kind of song-like quality to it, because it was meant to be, in a way, memorable.
Yeah.
Right? God of God, light of light, very God of very God. Like, it was meant to be something that even a person who's never been trained, who is just a simple farmer out in the country, that they could remember. Right? And like, if you don't remember anything else, This is who Jesus is. Take that home with you. like that because you don't have anything else to be able to bring home with you. You don't have a smartphone, you don't have an iPad, you don't have a notebook. So you only can take back what you could remember from those gatherings with other believers of Jesus. So I think, like, we have to really kind of remember that in many ways we are so privileged in the West because we don't feel that stress of having to remember and hold on to things and trying to recollect stuff and try to, like, do you remember what the pastor said last week? I'm trying to remember. He said something really cool, but I don't remember the exact wording. We don't feel that stress. We just go back to the website. We replay the sermon recording, or we look at the sermon notes or something like that. But for our brothers and sisters in the past, the pastors had to think of, like, how do I make something memorable that you will remember and that can actually help you live out the Christian life? So I think over the years, for myself personally, I obviously have become softer on the creeds. I've actually come to appreciate them a whole lot more because to come up with something that summarizes pretty much the Old and New Testament scriptures that you have read, that's not easy. And whenever I read the early church fathers materials, that's the crazy thing about them, is that they will bring you the context. Like, they will quote you 3 whole chapters of the book of Isaiah. They don't just bring you a verse because they didn't have that. They would just say, hey, remember this? And then blah, 3 chapters worth. And what ironically they're doing is they're giving you the local passage context that you have to read through that, think through it, and then you follow that church father's point from that point on. It's crazy. It's a different way of doing interpretation. It's so not what we're used to in the West.
Interesting. So, Heiser on this topic says, something. He says, while something included in a Christian creed might be more important than an item excluded from the creed for the purpose of identifying oneself as a Christian, it isn't at all the case that an issue excluded from a creed is less important for understanding the worldview of the biblical writers, which is in turn essential for understanding their message. In other words, things that don't make into creeds can be crucial for grasping biblical theology. When the unseen realm gets into subject matter that can't be found in a creed, those items should not be offhandedly considered peripheral. Part of the problem with creeds is that every one of them is historically conditioned. Creeds are formed in a response to some problem or need that contributes to their incompleteness. They are statements of faith and doctrinal conclusions that presumably their creators can justify through exegesis of the biblical text. My interest and ultimately theological loyalty are attached to the latter, not the former. It's just an issue of priority. So, it's not a good idea to take one of the creeds and be like, hey, this is the conclusion of the creeds. Therefore, on this particular passage, we must accept this particular passage, because that passage might not even be about the same topic of the creed to begin with. So
the creeds were formed from the early church fathers, like, own reckoning through their own exegetical work on the passages. That's the thing, right? Like, even the Nicene Creed, it's alluding to New Testament texts about God, a very God, that Jesus is basically, he came from the Father, right? It's an allusion to it, but they're using particular wording to bring certain clarity to the regular layperson. But I mean, because of that, when you realize that that's what's going on, it makes it less reasonable to actually assume, well, the creed is a good measuring rod. No, it's the result of them using the proper measuring rod, Scripture. So you don't use the result of measuring the rod. Like, you go back to the measuring rod.
So, those are kind of interpretation questions, but the book is a lot on other things. Genesis 1, Genesis 6, Genesis 11, Psalm 82, a lot of other different topics. One of the extra sections that he had, which I found really interesting, is, so of course, Genesis 6, he talks about how the sons of God, Nephilim, that context is very similar, or maybe even comes from the Mesopotamian background of Apkallu and all that different stuff there that he's talked about in other texts, and he talks about in this one. But the reason why he mentioned there's an added section is because some scholars have argued that this his background of the sons of God, Nephilim giants, it actually shouldn't come from something like Enoch, or it's not similar to Enoch. It's really more closer to the Greek Titan mythologies, and this is chapter 26. And in that culture, in the Greek culture, they have giants, but they're not completely similar to what we have in the Genesis 6 text. Scholars still would say, hey, this is where it came from. And he kind of addresses some of the arguments in the chapter there. I was just going to go through it and then have, list what my Heiser was going to kind of responded to it. Did you want to say something before I did that?
Yeah, I think one thing to also kind of highlight, and this was also part of the conversation I had with a friend recently, where in the original Unseen Realm, Mike had this, like, I think it was like a 2-paragraph blurb,
okay,
where he stated what he thought Genesis chapters 1 through 11 were probably like, when were they formed? Mm-hmm. Where did they come from? When were they compiled? Mm-hmm. And his proposal, he follows in some sense the critical scholarship that generally goes around, that works around Genesis 1 through 11, which is this was probably compiled during or after the exile in Babylon. Right? A lot of critical scholarship generally think chapters 1 through 11 are different from the rest of Genesis, from 12 onward to the end. That 1 through 11 is its own very sort of prehistory. That was a compilation of different sources and materials. Maybe some of it was from Moses, but not necessarily all of it. And that's why he would start talking things about, like, oh, Genesis 1 through 3 is a polemic. Genesis 6 is a polemic. Well, a polemic is an argument against something that's out there. What is it arguing against then? Mm-hmm. And that's why he goes into that material about the the Nephilim and the Apocalypse. Yes, I'm trying to say it. It's like also really late at night now. But that's kind of generally his starting point, right? Of how you view chapters 1 through 11. If you are of other Old Testament scholarship, confessing, but you believe all of Genesis is written directly or mostly by Moses, mm-hmm. then your assumption of the timeline for Genesis 1 through 11 will not be exilic. It will be probably closer to Egyptian and Mesopotamian. So earlier. So then the question is, can you prove from that time frame and from that source material that Genesis 6 is talking about hybrids, talking about, 2/3 or half, human, half divine being? Can you show that from that type of source material? And that's actually probably more of a challenge. And I think that's partly why there's a pushback, because, generally scholarship, when it comes down to the Torah, it's either you're going for the hypothesis theory, JDEP, or you're going with complete Mosaic authorship. With some, caveats. Yes, Moses didn't write his death, right, for example. Mm-hmm. But, the two major camps are that way. Hypothesis theory is kind of on the waning because it just hasn't really panned out very well. It keeps changing. What was something that was a priest document all of a sudden now is an Elohim document today. What was a Yahweh document is now, another type of document. And so there's no real conclusive evidence. But then the only other option for the most part was Mosaic authorship. How Dr. Heiser got around this was that he actually went with a methodology that is older but not as common anymore, which was a supplementarian method. You have a core Mosaic document, a core Mosaic authorship, with other hands who are involved in compiling the materials and other sources and other things to make what we later now know as the 5 books of the Torah. Right. And so, anyways, I want to just bring up that little context. It's so funny to me is that Mike brought up Genesis 1 through 11, this is how I view it. It's probably exilic. I follow the more of the general consensus on the scholarship about this, but it's different from a lot of evangelical scholarship, right? Because a lot of folks tend to go towards Mosaic or document hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know exactly where the whole Greek, the scholars that argue it came from, like the Greek myths, where they come from.
Well, part of that is because in the exilic period, you start having the influence of Hellenistic literature.
Okay, so
right.
So that would be very much later then.
Yeah, and so it's going to be starting to come up and crop up in that time, because remember, the Greeks are around. They aren't necessarily as strong as the Babylonians or the Persians at that point, but they one day will be. And they are existing. Their stories are already being spread across through merchants and through trade and through interaction with the other nations, because Greece was, all those city-states were still interacting with the larger world. And so that's why there's that pushback, because you do have now the onset of, okay, Hellenistic writing is starting to show up. Greek influence is starting to appear in the world. They're interacting with Babylon, Assyria, Persia, everyone, because everyone's starting to know, like, oh, wow, there's all these different nations and other peoples outside of our lands.
Yeah, no, very good point. So, I imagine they're probably coming, maybe even part of like the Russell Merkin or whatever that crowd that maybe even thinks the Old Testament or at least the Torah was written way late. But either way, so that's some those would argue that, hey, those actually came, the sons of God giants thing came from Greek culture, not this Mesopotamian background. And it seems that oftentimes they actually don't even notice or understand or are aware of the Mesopotamian background. But either way, Michael Heiser says, hey, we're going to take them to task. So one of the arguments they would use says that the Septuagint uses Titanon for Rephaim, and that's a word that kind of comes from that Greek culture. So it's like, oh, well, maybe that's a strong reason that they thought there was some mix there. But Heiser's like, hey, that only means that one Septuagint translator thought it was the same. It doesn't follow that that's actually where the origin came from. And then you have Tartarus in the New Testament. So this is the Second Peter or First Peter, whichever. And Tartarus is used to refer to the offending sons of God called angels, and how they wind up in the abyss, Tartarus, bad world of spirits. I have a recent interview on that one. You can check it out. But Heiser's like, well, this is a Greek writer, or whoever wrote Second Peter or First Peter, who uses Greek words that ancient readers would understand better. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the origin. And of course, it's a pretty late text in comparison to when this Sons of God thing came about. So I don't see how that would even make much sense as an argument to begin with. Then some argued that the Prometheus Vinctus text teaches men all kinds of arts, which compares with the Sons of God. So it's like, oh, well, maybe that's where it came from, because this Prometheus Vinctus text. But he's like, hey, well, the Apkallu myth also has forbidden knowledge given. So it seems like it's an equal footing there. So why we assume that it's from a Greek origin? And finally, he has other objections. He says there's fundamental differences. The Titans are not a mix of gods and women. So there's a disconnect there between the Genesis texts. There's chronological and conceptual disconnect with Titans and the Great Flood. In the Greek culture, he says there's no clear Greek flood. So there is a Greek flood. I'd be interested to hear more about that if that were possible. But so there is a Greek flood, but I guess what he's saying is that it's not closely related to the sons of God. In other words, he's basically saying, hey, there's not a lot of similarities between these. We should think it's Mesopotamian. And that's actually what, I don't know if that's actually what Brian Doak says. I interviewed him, but he argues that, yeah, there is a conceptual link, and maybe the Genesis 6 writer did get some of its context, or maybe the later Raphaim or the giants and the conquest narratives. Maybe there was some type of theme or concepts that came from Greek culture, but that doesn't mean that the whole entire thing, the whole story came from Greek culture. Maybe that's just how they kind of viewed that. And you can check out my interview with him on that. I know there's a lot of information for everybody, but that's a little section. So this isn't just about like interpretation or something like that that was added. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's good that he brought up, some of the typical objections and tried to address that, because the Greek material is generally used as a way to explain those references that are in Jude and Enoch, Jude and I think it was First Peter. Partly because the New Testament was written during the Hellenistic period. It's in that time frame, right? And exposure to Greek culture was ubiquitous. You couldn't really escape it. I mean, your reaction pretty much as a Second Temple Jew was, how Greek are you going to? How Greek will you be? Will you actually only be able to speak Greek? Do you basically become so Greek that you don't want to be Jewish, or do you go the other way and you're so anti-Greek anything, but in the end you're still responding to Greek culture? And so I think that there isn't really any way to fully dispel the objection, because the reality is Hellenistic culture was really, really successful in just getting itself out there. I mean, heck, even the Romans in the end adopted even the Greek pantheon essentially into their own Roman pantheon, just with different names. So, I mean, I understand, and I'm glad that Mike brought up this material to be able to address the common reasoning of why this is probably maybe Greek origin. But hey, here's answers back against that. I'm also glad he mentioned about the Septuagint thing, because I think some folks generally have a misconception about the Septuagint. Septuagint was not, I mean, in legend, it was done, I think, by 70 people within a span of a couple of months or a year. But the actual real timeline of the Septuagint was, it took a couple of decades in the end for pretty much all of the Old Testament to get translated into some version of Greek. And it wasn't done in like one giant committee.
Right.
And it definitely took some time. And they also had variations on how literal or paraphrasic they were going to be. Right. So it all kind of depended on like who was the translator and how well did they understand did that person know Greek and Hebrew. And so the skill set also varied depending on who was the person who did the translation. And then ultimately what variations did we ultimately pick for the what we now have as a Septuagint, as an official text.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
There's complications, and that's just part of the what happens when we're going into such ancient texts in the ancient world.
Yeah, I appreciate you pointing all that out, summarizing. That's really helpful. So yeah, I hope people enjoy this video. We got a lot of really interesting topics, and there's a lot more that happens in this book. It's a huge book. People should check it out. I was thinking like, hey, it should be required reading for I don't know what, seminary students. I don't know, Bible study students. Who knows? I don't know if that's probably a good idea. Probably a good idea. But anyways, yeah. So yeah, I really appreciate you coming on here, Mike, and to talk about this book. Really cool, awesome book. And I'll put a link in the description so people can check it out. But there'll also be links to your channels, what you're doing, and the description, so people can check out that as well. People check out your work and your channel. A lot of fun stuff there. Any last thoughts before we get going?
I would say it's a very comforting thing to be able to read words from Mike again. I don't know if you felt this way when you were reading this for the first time, but because I'm aware, right, that he didn't have a lot of time left, and so he's not able to work with an editorial team, and they could send information back and suggestions and maybe change this or adjust your tone or something like that. And so it is kind of strange, but in a very refreshing way, that in those gray sections of the added text, like I could actually hear Mike's signature snark, like his dry humor sometimes. But at the same time, like he was a really good teacher. And a good teacher is someone who can absorb so much data and material and yet then explain it to you in a paragraph or two.
Mhm.
And it just shows, even despite the fact that he was battling such a terrible disease, and yet he had still the mental focus to be able to actually put something out that's still very understandable.
Mhm.
Like, that's incredible to me. And so, yeah, it's a good little thing to just kind of learn some new material from Dr. Heiser after a few years since he's passed away. It's neat to be able to get that opportunity again.
Yeah. 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 I would second those thoughts. Well, thank you so much again for coming on here. As I said, people check out the book, YouTube channels, everything, like and subscribe. The videos that we mentioned in this interview, a lot of really good data out there to check out. But anyways, thank you so much, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Oh, psych, one more question. Purple Pill Philosophy asked, sorry to take so much of your time, Mike. It says, you, uh, oh gosh. Oh, let's go back up here. Okay. Ask Dr. Chu what his response is to certain scholars who think Yahweh was considered a different deity than El Elyon in Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82. Now, and then he says, rather than different versions of the one God. It's okay if you didn't prepare for this one, but did you have any thoughts you wanted to add?
Well, I do remember there in the new added material, Mike actually addressed that directly. And
Cool.
one of the things is that is more of a recent, modern, and more critical scholarship interpretation, right? That Elyon and Yahweh, El, are different deities. I would agree where Mike is landing, because I think one of the things we have to remember is that the book of Psalms, whoever's compiling these Psalms, they're probably coming from the perspective of a Second Temple, if not exilic Jew, who is bringing in songs and hymns that would be something that, as an Israelite, as a Yahweh worshiper, would probably use. And so I don't necessarily think that you have to say, oh, its originality was supposed to be El Elyon and Yahweh are different gods and whatnot. It's like, okay, you could make that argument, but in the end, it's compiled into the book of Psalms, probably by a Yahwist, with the intention of you to understand that when you read El and Elyon, it's in reference to Yahweh. Right? Because that's the thing. As I was getting into seminary education and listening to Mike's material and getting into more biblical studies, you read some of the research. Yes, Psalm 82 is really old. It's really, really old. And Mike even mentioned in the added material that it makes no mention of Moses, makes no mention of creation, makes no mention of anything that would be semblance of an Israelite, familiarity. So it's like that old. It's so old that we don't even know exactly where and when was it written, and where did it actually come from directly. Psalm 24 is a similar story. The whole entire thing of, like, the King of Glory, open up you gates, the King of Glory is coming in. Like, that also, according to scholarship, is extremely old, and they have no idea ultimately where did it come from. Like, that it appears to be related to the Baal epic, but its originality, we're not sure. It's like some of the Psalms in our Bible are really old. And so I think in the end, you just can't get away from the fact that they compiled them together in the book of Psalms. The editors, the writers, the people who are bringing this collection together, they had an agenda. And so who were they? Well, they were Yahweh worshipers. So if they're Yahweh worshipers, who do you think they thought Elyon was? Right? Who do you think they thought El was? They're making the contention it's Yahweh, probably. Because why would they include that in the text? What Mike brings up in that additional material is that you have to bring in another assumption, that the Israelites were polytheistic, that the Israelites were worshiping multiple gods and not just Yahweh, instead of maybe considering maybe a lot of the Israelites were, yes, heretical in their beliefs, or they were unorthodox in their beliefs, but the official actual what they were supposed to be doing was to be worshipers of only Yahweh. But we also know historically that wasn't the case. They were worshiping other gods because they were basically trying to cover all their bases. I'll worship Yahweh, but I'll also worship Baal. I'll also worship Asherah. I'll also worship Molech because I want to make sure I can please any god because I need an advantage somehow. And so just because they practiced heretically does not mean that the official religion was not Yahwehism. Right? That's a modern way of saying it. But I hope that makes sense. I hope that makes sense for the person who's asking the question.
Awesome. Much appreciated. Okay. Now you can like and subscribe because it's the end of the video. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night, guys.